Yeah.
How's your heart?
Oh.
My sister's right. My heart's okay. How about tonight? Good as new?
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started because we want to give Rich as much time as possible to present, but we're so grateful on this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend to have Rich presenting. Pretty much we got the expert here, so as a history teacher, so I'm so grateful to have him.
He's rolling his sleeves up, so he's getting...
Yeah, he's getting serious.
Thanks everybody for coming. It's a delight to see you on a morning where I'm not sure any of us knew if we were actually going to be slogging our way through snow to get here. That hasn't yet happened, and it's not going to happen until later in the day. So we got a clear field with which to work. Today we're going to be looking at an awful, a terrible event, probably the worst event in the history of the civil rights movement. And there were a lot of tough ones, but this was as tough as they get. And we'll be looking at it as church people, as Christian people, from the standpoint of how two important black figures, black American figures, attempted to help a congregation, and I'm going to define that very broadly, to process grief after that awful event. And the question that we're going to try to answer today is, to what extent did Martin Luther King's and John Coltrane's responses to the 1963 16th Street Baptist Church bombing resemble one another?
Oh no, what have I done?
We're okay. Well, I got it wrong. I got it upside down. Folks, you have to know, this is not going to be a big ha-ha kind of thing, but I've got to tell you that as a school teacher, I was the most limited technological person. And I just proved it right there. I usually, when I've presented here in the past, I have not usually presented from scriptural text. Today, it's appropriate, and most of us recognize this text. Most of us encounter it not long after Christmas, when Herod slaughters the innocents in his search for the Messiah, and I think it's very appropriate for what we're going to be looking at today, as is this. Can everybody see that okay? So we need to reflect on those as we look at this today. And I think I'd like to start with prayer. And so let's pray. Creator, teacher, Spirit, we're here assembled on this Martin Luther King Day weekend. We're here assembled on the day before our every 4-year inaugural ritual. We bring to both of those a big range of emotions. Help us as a nation to care for one another across the lines that divide us. Help us as a nation to live up to our founding principle of human equality, respect for natural rights, government by consent. Help us to be the good nation that you intend for us to be. All right, so what we're going to try to do today is to take a look at two texts. One of them, a traditional written text. Another, a text that has no words. It's just all music. The first of them is sitting at your seat or in your lap, and that is the eulogy that Martin Luther King delivered on September 18th, 1963 at 16th Street Baptist Church for young girls who died in a terrorist attack at that church. We're going to start there. And I'd like to see if at someplace around 20 after the hour, we can transition off of that and onto another text, which is a musical piece called Alabama, written and performed by John Coltrane and the John Coltrane Quartet. So if you're somebody that likes to kind of check your watch as things go on, and we start to get around 9:20, and I don't show any sign whatsoever of slowing down on the King piece, would you please just kind of say, hey, we're around 9:20, do you want to transition? Clarence, Brenda, there are some handouts up here if you want them, and there are some seats, but we can get them back to you.
Front row is fine, it works.
Steve Hesse's up there, Patty's up there. Okay, we will shortly be taking a look together at the packet that you've got at your spot. And we're going to go at this as historians, and historians go into documents looking for four things: authorship, intended audience and purpose, historical context, and then point of view, message. Let's start with authorship. Now, the author is Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And let's just ask ourselves, who is Martin Luther King by early September 1963? Well, of course, he's the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is the most influential and the most powerful of the civil rights organizations. It's basically an organization of black pastors, most of them middle-aged. King is a prodigious fundraiser, and he's the most visible black man in America at that point. He also can boast, he's not a boastful person, but he can boast three big victories by September of 1963. One, the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56, which went on for over a year and resulted in the desegregation of Montgomery bus lines. Two, a major campaign in Birmingham itself, a city that the civil rights movement referred to as Bombingham because of the tendency of the Ku Klux Klan in that town, which had infiltrated the police department and the fire department to use bombs to intimidate any Birmingham blacks who appeared to be asserting themselves. The Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a prominent civil rights leader in Birmingham, had had his parsonage bombed on Christmas Eve back in the 1950s, and he had barely survived it. There was a section of town, mostly inhabited by middle-class blacks, that was so routinely hit by bombs that it was nicknamed Dynamite Hill. It's a tough town. It's the most segregated city in America. And King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference know that if they can go into that city and win victories, they will have done a great deal. To break the back of segregation in Birmingham is to achieve something truly noteworthy. You know the story, you've seen the images, you've seen the German shepherds sicked on nonviolent civil rights protesters, you've seen the fire hoses trained on nonviolent civil rights protesters. You probably know that many of those protesters were young people, high school students and even younger, when it became impossible to continue to fill the jails with adults. It turns out to be a great victory, but a hard-won victory. The third big victory for King has come just a few weeks before. On August 28, 1963, the March on Washington has succeeded beyond all hopes, and King has given the greatest speech of his life to that point, the I Have a Dream speech, which gets quoted a lot around this time. They weren't sure how it would work. The Kennedy administration was very frightened of it. They had troopers from the 82nd Airborne on helicopters ready to go to Washington if there was civil unrest. There was none, and it was a great, great victory. So he comes into September of 1963 having achieved a great deal. He has not yet been given the Nobel Peace Prize, but that's going to happen in 1964. So King himself is not just a successful leader, but he's a victorious leader at this point. In early September, probably in the wake of the desegregation of Birmingham stores and other public places, 9 years after the Brown versus Ford ruling, the courts ordered the desegregation of schools in 4 Alabama cities. One of them is Birmingham. On September, that's round about September 1st, when the federal courts ordered the opening of schools on an integrated basis to black students, Governor George Wallace, who is of course the antithesis of King, he's sort of King's great antagonist, immediately sends in Alabama state troopers to block entrance from black students. And so basically he says, we're not doing it. On September 9th, a federal court orders Wallace to remove the troopers. Wallace removes the troopers and sends in the Alabama National Guard. On September 10th, President Kennedy federalizes the National Guard, and when he does that, he basically says, go back to your barracks. And desegregation begins in Birmingham and 3 other Alabama cities. This is important historical context for what's going to happen next. Wallace reacts to this. He can't do much, but Wallace reacts to this by saying, what this country needs are some first-class funerals and some political funerals, too. Meanwhile, a Klansman, a member of the Cahaba River Clavern, which is a pretty tough bunch, says to a sister of his that same week, you just wait until after Sunday morning, and they will beg us to let them segregate. What happens on Sunday morning is probably known to us all. We've talked about it before. 16th Street Baptist Church in the heart of Birmingham. Some of you have been there. Some of you have seen it. It's a prominent downtown church. It's the biggest of the downtown churches that is a primarily black church. And this is the church from which an awful lot of the civil rights activity earlier in the year had come from. They'd used it as a staging area. The church itself had said, we're committed. We're gonna do what we can to bring this about. If you've been to Birmingham, and at least a few of us in the room have, you know that just outside this church is a park called Kelly Ingram Park. Kelly Ingram Park is where most of the footage that you see, when you see footage, is happening. It's the point through which the demonstrators were trying to pass so that they could get to the Birmingham Business District, and it's where Bull Connor established his line of battle to try to stop them. On the morning of September 15th, 1963, Children's Sunday, it's a Sunday morning, a bomb planted by Chambliss, Herman Cash, Thomas Blanton, and Bobby Frank Cherry, all 4 Klansmen from the Cahaba River Clavern, is detonated just before services. Denise McNair, 11. Carol Robertson, 14. Addie Mae Collins, 14. Cynthia Wesley, 14, are all killed in that blast. Addie Mae's sister, Sarah, is hit by flying glass in the face and loses sight of an eye, and to this day has relatively little sight in that other eye. These 4 girls are all killed in the blast, which destroys some cars and does significant structural damage to the building. There are, of course, King is somebody that always is wedded to nonviolence, But he's not in town. He doesn't live in Birmingham. He doesn't serve a church in Birmingham. He's in Atlanta. And of course, when something like this happens, emotion spills over, and there is violence in the wake of it, as angry Birmingham blacks take to the streets. When the police move in to quell the violence, which pretty much is like rock throwing and things like that, a 16-year-old named Johnny Robinson, fleeing the police, is shot in the back by a police officer. Later that day, Virgil Ware, who's 11 years old, unaware of what's happened in the middle of Birmingham, he's out with his brother, riding around on a bicycle, looking for parts so that they can essentially cannibalize parts and make a second bicycle because they just got paper routes. Virgil Ware is shot off the handlebars of his brother's bike by 2 White Eagle Scouts who had just attended a segregationist meeting. That's the historical context for what's happened. And it's from that point that we're going to take a look at what happens on September 18th. The morning of September 18th, Wednesday of that week, King has been brought in to preach at the funeral for 3 of the 4 girls. One of the families couldn't do it. They just couldn't do a big public funeral. And so he is brought in to eulogize them. And now we're going to take a look at what King does here. So let's take up our eulogy for the martyred children. Now, because we're trying to do a few things here today, I think the best way for us to do this is for me to read aloud and for you to follow along. And what I'd like you to do, we're going to give you a highlighter, I think, here. What I'd like you to do is, as we read, and we have pens for people, as we read, would you please just mark any passages that just jump out at you? That, I think we've got pens for people. Don't have highlighters, I got John. Okay. Yeah. There we go, and we got some pens here. Anybody not have something to write with? Okay. Now, as we take a look at this, let's remember, we're kind of working as historians here. So let's think about King's intended audience. Let's think about his purpose. Let's also see if we can discern his point of view, his message, his argument. You read along with me, and as you're reading, highlight any passage that helps you to ascertain that purpose or that argument or that point of view. After each of the 4 segments that we look at, we'll just stop, and we'll take maybe 2 comments. Floor is open. And the only reason why I'm going to limit a little bit is so that we make sure that we can get on to Coltrane a little later on, okay? So here goes. King says, "These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. And yet they died nobly. They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity. And so this afternoon, in a real sense, they have something to say to each of us in their death. They have something to say to every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. They have something to say to every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism." You can also hear, in effect, the congregation responding and reacting. They have something to say to a federal government that has compromised with the undemocratic practices of Southern Dixiecrats and the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing Northern Republicans. They have something to say to every Negro who has passively accepted the evil system of segregation and who has stood on the sidelines in a mighty struggle for justice. They say to each of us, black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy, which produced the murderers. Their death says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly for the realization of the American dream. We'll stop there. What did you mark? What did you see? What did you hear? I said he was in the morning. It's actually an afternoon service. Steve?
I think it's interesting that even back in 1963, King was drawing attention to the fact that it's not simply individual choices. Individual choices are certainly important, but there's also systematic racism, which feels like more recent language to me, but it's interesting to see that it goes all the way back.
Thanks. Bill?
I like that phrase, we must substitute courage for caution, because I think sometimes none of us realize how dangerous it was for these people to rise up, even to do something as peaceful as a boycott. There was a lot of physical abuse and danger associated with standing up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anybody else? Yeah,
It was disturbing to me to read every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred. It's disturbing because that's still going on.
A long history of that in America. You know, you can sometimes do pretty well politically with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiling of racism. I think one of the
named Aaron Burr.
Hmm?
Somebody named Aaron Burr. Goes back to that part.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me about this is how political he goes right off the bat. You know, 4 children have died, and the first place King goes is really the movement and the political situation that the movement is fighting against. Jim?
He mentions all the people who have passionately accepted the evil system. So he's really putting the ownership on anybody who puts up with it.
Yeah. Which is pretty much all of us that, you know, essentially enabled it by not stepping up. Okay, let's move on to the second segment. And by the way, these are edited segments. The eulogy was a little bit longer, though it wasn't long. Part 2. The spilled blood of these innocent girls may cause the whole citizenry of Birmingham to transform the negative extremes of a dark past into the positive extremes of a bright future. Indeed, this tragic event may cause the white South to come to terms with its conscience. And so I stand here to say this afternoon to all assembled here that in spite of the darkness of this hour, we must not despair. We must not become bitter, nor must we harbor the desire to retaliate with violence. No. We must not lose faith in our white brothers. Somehow, we must believe that the most misguided among them can learn to respect the dignity and the worth of all human personality. What do we see there that we react to? Yeah, Mary.
I think he's speaking with a hope that hasn't exactly happened. We must not lose faith in our white brothers. I don't know that that's exactly happened yet. And that the South comes to term with its conscience, you know.
I have to, you know, we talk about intended audience, and we know that he's got an audience in front of him. It's a packed church. It's a big church, and it's a packed church. Furthermore, this is not just going to be heard by the people that are sitting there that day. I mean, we're hearing it right now. But I wonder how that audience, that physical audience in front of them, that had been through so much trauma, here, we must not lose faith in our white brothers. We must believe that the most misguided among them, in other words, these 4 guys, he doesn't know that it's 4 guys, but we now know that it was 4 guys. We must not lose faith that even they could learn to respect the dignity and worth of all human personality.
I
I'm one of the 4 parents. Go ahead.
I think it took a lot of courage to say that to that audience at that point.
Why do you think that?
Well, because what sign was there that the whites would respect? You know, it just, with what had happened, I think that was courageous.
Right, and we know that there was a violent reaction among Birmingham blacks after the outrage happened, after the murder took place. You know, and who can blame that? But now here's King saying that wasn't the way to go. That isn't the way to go. And trust me, the whites are gonna get where we want them to be. But once again, oh yeah, really? What's your evidence for saying that? And there was evidence, but it wasn't all over the place. Let's move on to part 3, unless somebody wanted to put something else in. Okay. Part 3. May I now say a word to you, the members of the bereaved families. It is almost impossible to say anything that can console you at this difficult hour and remove the deep clouds of disappointment which are floating in your mental skies. I hope you can find some consolation from Christianity's affirmation that death is not the end. Death is not a period that ends the great sentence of life, but a comma that punctuates it to more lofty significance. Death is not a blind alley that leads the human race into a state of nothingness, but an open door which leads man into life eternal. Let this daring faith, this great invincible surmise, be your sustaining power during these trying days. Now I say to you in conclusion, life is hard. At times, as hard as crucible steel. It has its bleak and difficult moments. And if one will hold on, he will discover that God walks with him, and that God is able to lift you from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope, and transform dark and desolate valleys into sunlight paths of inner peace.
This is so modern in the sense, or theologically current in the sense that he doesn't say God will fix it. He says God will walk with you. And no, just that's the powerful phrase for me.
Thank you. Yeah, Marty.
The fact that all throughout his life and through what we've read so far, never violence.
Right.
Never violence is the answer.
Right. Thank you.
I think that's what distinguishes Martin Luther King from most of the other leaders, in that he chose nonviolence and continued to choose it no matter how, and that's why he became as revered as famous as he was, because he stuck to it.
He's got a bunch of really gifted leaders under him, subordinates, who were also deeply devoted to it. And let's not forget, he's got foot soldiers that are devoted to it too. I mean, those high school kids and those junior high kids who withstood those attacks by German shepherds, trained to go for the midsection and fire hoses. You know, that's a pretty big commitment to nonviolence. One that I've thought about many times. I'm not sure that I could make that kind of commitment. I just don't think I could do it. So it's almost a superhuman thing. This is almost the most Christian, traditional part of what we're looking at, isn't it? I mean, he could wind up saying that about 4 junior high-age girls who were in a car crash, you know, or some other calamitous accident that was maybe nobody's fault. You know, in that respect, he's being a Christian minister, administering succor to grieving people. There's almost nothing at all in here, in this segment, about the circumstances. But there is that line, life is hard, as hard as crucible steel. I mean, he's right. It's also not clear what that knowledge gets us, but it's a powerful adage from a religious leader. Let's go to the fourth statement.
His use of imagery makes this such a powerful statement.
Yeah, he's a really good writer.
Yeah.
You know, among other things, we think of him, you know, in terms of the voice. The voice is powerful, but most everything that he did that has lived on in terms of, you know, the great set piece speeches were very, very carefully written, and this is another of those. It's interesting that he only gets to the parents and speaks to them, you know, after he's done the kind of political thing and the thing that says, maybe we can redeem this now. So he says, and now we're at the conclusion, and so today you do not walk alone. You gave to this world wonderful children. They didn't live long lives, but they lived meaningful lives. Their lives were distressingly small in quantity, but glowingly large in quality. And no greater tribute can be paid to you as parents, and no greater epitaph can come to them as children than where they died and what they were doing when they died. They did not die in the dives and dens of Birmingham, nor did they die discussing and listening to filthy jokes. They died between the sacred walls of the Church of God, and they were discussing the eternal meaning of love. This stands out as a beautiful, beautiful thing for all generations. Shakespeare had Horatio to say some beautiful words as he stood over the dead body of Hamlet. And today, as I stand over the remains of these beautiful, darling girls, I paraphrase the words of Shakespeare. Good night, sweet princesses. Good night, those who symbolize a new day. And may the flight of angels take thee to thy eternal rest. God bless you. What do we see there?
You're not alone.
Yeah, which is carried over from the earlier piece too, right? I don't think there was I don't know of another King's speech in which he quoted Shakespeare. King James Bible a lot, Abraham Lincoln sometimes, but Shakespeare was not usually a go-to for him. Here, it's I don't know if it was improvised or if it was written into the original text. It's certainly in this text. And the reaction of the people in the congregation is powerful. So what is he doing in this eulogy? If you pull it all together, if you look at the various parts that we've looked at, you know, starting with the political piece, then the part about, well, maybe the blood of these children will finally get the South in the right place. And then into the message to the parents, the traditional Christian message, people are grieving, and then this closing, which is kind of interesting in a way because he almost seems to be a preacher who's preaching to a subsegment of this audience that don't tell dirty jokes, don't hang around in the dives and dens of Birmingham. It's almost like he's taking a little commercial break here and saying, hey, you know, for those of you that aren't living such upstanding lives, look at these girls who were. You know, it's a kind of an odd, it doesn't really fit to me there. But if you look at the whole thing, taken as a whole, and we know now, author, intended audience, we can think a little bit about purpose here and what his message is. What do you think?
I just think love.
Explain what you think about that.
Well, maybe because through all of this horror, he's still shooting for kindness.
And he understands, it's a really helpful comment, he understands that these parents have just lost people that they dearly love. And he also realizes that this is just gonna keep happening unless we figure out what loving one another means. It's right on target, thanks. John, Phil?
He accomplishes so many things in a short speech, you know. Discussing the outrage of the act, he is still able to preach reconciliation and forgiveness, very Christ-like, that part of the speech. And then this end part of the speech, he delivers this beautiful goodbye to the little girls and courage to the parents. And then he addresses the greater audience with talking about for an end of segregation and hatred and all that. So he preaches outside of the church to all of America. And as you said, Rich, a little admonishment for everybody to try to do better in how we live our lives as to what these girls are. So to me, it's an amazing eulogy because it covered everything.
Right. And I'm glad you went to the question of audience, because there's this audience, just like right now, I can look at all of you, we can look at one another, and there's that audience for him. He's standing there in that pulpit, and he sees all these faces looking at him, expecting some kind of sustenance at a time when they're in the wilderness. And yet he also knows, because he's Martin Luther King, that the audience is going to be a much larger one.
So what happened after this speech?
He was shot.
That didn't happen for 5 years. John F. Kennedy, in June of that year, after George Wallace had stood in the door of the University of Alabama, barring 2 perfectly qualified black students from entering and desegregating, called for the enactment of a Civil Rights Act. It was going nowhere. The political forces that he identified earlier, Southern Dixiecrats and Northern right-wing Republicans, were blocking that legislation. It did not get passed before Kennedy's death. But this probably helped to prepare the way a little bit. It's a terrible, terrible thing to think that you have to kill 4 junior high girls to get there. This probably prepares the ground a little bit for another death, John F. Kennedy's death. And when Johnson becomes president, Johnson says, the first thing I'm going to ask the Congress for, in tribute to our fallen president, passage of that act. And it passed in '64. A year later, after similar outrages in Selma, the Voting Rights Act passes. In 1968, supporting sanitation workers in Memphis, King is assassinated. I guess that would perhaps do.
Well, this is powerful rhetoric in an important cause. And I think it's worth noting that immediately thereafter, and I'm talking about 2 or 3 or 4 months after this, nothing happened.
Right. Yeah, there's no tangible result immediately. There is, however, a major legislative victory.
Right.
But we all know, the wheels of government tend to turn slowly. I think what I'd like to do, unless somebody has more on this, is I'd like to transition over. Yeah, Mary? I think you're going to get the last word before we look at John Coltrane.
I just have, what was the year of the 3 civil rights workers killed in Mississippi?
Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were killed in Neshoba County, Mississippi in the summer of '64, the so-called Freedom Summer, in which a lot of white and black northern students came down to collaborate with local black civil rights workers to try to do voting registration. That's a big, important summer. New Jersey has a little role in that one because it's at the Atlantic City Democratic Convention that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party really kind of shakes things up quite a bit. Yeah, but that's 64. So the deaths don't end, you know. And Medgar Evers was gunned down in his driveway in front of his kids in 63, and of course King will ultimately. Yeah. Okay, on to Coltrane. I'm just going to do a little bit of author work, and then I want you to be thinking intended audience, purpose, and message of the musical piece that we'll look at. John Coltrane, born in North Carolina, raised for the most part in North Carolina. Family moves to Philadelphia, and Coltrane winds up learning how to play the saxophone, and gosh, does he learn how to play the saxophone. By the late 50s, he is a noted sort of a sideman, first for the Miles Davis Quintet, and then for Thelonious Monk. By 1960, he's so prominent as a gifted saxophonist that he has created he becomes the leader of his own band. And probably the biggest crossover number that he did that actually kind of made it into the pop charts was, and you may have heard it, was the Coltrane Quartet's version of My Favorite Things, you know, from The Sound of Music, and it's an arresting and almost hypnotic kind of a version. I recommend it to you, and you know that's a kind of an up song, right? It's about the things we love and things like that. And by 1963, the time that all of these things are going on, Coltrane has assembled what has gone down in jazz history as maybe one of the great jazz quartets of all time. There's John Coltrane on saxophone, McCoy Tyner on piano, Jimmy Garrison on bass, and Elvin Jones on the drums. They're big. And Coltrane himself, it's like St. Augustine. You know, he's come through some things. Like a lot of people in the jazz world, he had a significant drug habit. He was a heroin addict at one point. He had been addicted to alcohol. He's beaten those things by the early 60s. He's an interesting guy, very spiritual. He is the grandson of two AME ministers, and he's a lifelong searcher spiritually, who is certainly interested in Christianity, and probably would consider himself a Christian, but is also interested in Eastern mysticism and things like that. In 1966, on a tour in Tokyo, when asked by a reporter, "What would you like to be?" Coltrane's answer is, "I would like to be a saint," which is such an interesting answer. What we're going to do right now is we're going to take a look, and you know, you got to understand, I was a history teacher, not a music teacher, and I never played a musical instrument, but we do have people in here that know how to play musical instruments very well, so we're really going to be looking for help from them. But what I'd like to do is I'd like us to take a look at a relatively long video. It runs about 6 minutes. And this is the Coltrane Quartet performing a song called Alabama, a song that Coltrane wrote and first performed in November of 1963, though it was earlier in the month than the Kennedy assassination, so that's not a factor here. Let's look. The historical context is exactly what we've just dealt with, so we don't need to go back over that. But let's see if we can figure out his intended audience, his purpose, and his point of view, but there won't be any words to help us. As you listen and watch, reflect on the central event. Reflect on Addie Mae, and Carol, and Denise, and Cynthia. Reflect on that act of violence. What is this piece trying to say about that? Listen to it as you might listen to Vivaldi's Four Seasons, or Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, or Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring. Just listen to it, trying to find imagery in it, and trying to figure out what the musician, the performers, were trying to do. And we'll talk about it after we listen to it. Let's see, Audrey, if we can Okay, you're good. Just a little.
don't think it's gonna start any video.
What did you hear? What did you see? Because there was a visual component to this. And what do you think about what you saw or heard, or how do you feel about what you saw or heard? It's a different kind of a text than what we worked with in the first half. Yeah, okay.
So in the beginning, I think he broke it down, and this is just my interpretation, it may have nothing to do with his intention, but, the first part was almost a cautious, mysterious, impending doom type of feeling that I got. And then as that piece went on, the rhythm changed, the rate changed, and it was more hopeful. And then towards the end, it became sad again. The whole tone changed to me, and it was like, there was caution there, and then the very last 30 seconds almost was like a fight, the cymbal, the drums. That's how I broke it up in my
Yeah, the way Elvin Jones finishes that piece off on those drums, I mean, he's totally under control.
Yes.
Because he's Elvin Jones playing the drums. But, and I agree with you, McCoy Tyner's piano, there's an ominous tone to this piece, that, well, what would those elements perhaps be saying?
I agree with what you just said. You just said ominous. I latched on to the piano guy.
Yeah, Tyner, yeah.
I don't know what the musical term, kind of like
I don't know.
the rolling.
It's like a drum roll, and you could see Elvin Jones, essentially doing a drum roll. Sorry.
A kind of pulsating, throbbing, whatever adjective you want to use, just impending doom, kind of just always there.
What's doomed? Who's doomed?
It sort of felt like a musical metaphor for the racial struggle.
I mean, isn't there something in here that's saying, keep it up, and see what you get, because we're not going to take this kind of thing forever.
Richard, that's exactly what I feel when I hear this piece, and the fact that you call it a contrast. I'm so glad you did that, because there was a generation, in fact, those young girls' age, that will be coming of age and going into college at the end of the 60s and into the 70s, that had a different perspective, that had a different view. Without getting into all of that, I just want to say that without that as being the antithesis to Kumbaya, so what did happen happened because there was an element that had, and this is what Coltrane just speaks to that. There was this undertone here. There's something about to happen. Yeah. And then in the middle section,
this is like the Coltrane solo.
Yeah.
It's about 2 minutes of that beginning line, then about 2 minutes of Coltrane solo, then 2 minutes return to the beginning line. Please,
here's the teacher, I love it. Then there's the wailing.
Yes.
So what he's doing is wailing. So you've got this ominous thing.
Yes.
And then the wailing, and saxophones are so good at doing that.
Yes.
Saxophonists, the saxophone as an instrument. And then, after the crying and the wailing, you move to this, now it's more than ominous. It is, a storm is about to rise.
Right.
A storm is coming. And at the end, you hear, where are we going with this? For me, so you've got this, and it is speaking to what was happening in the streets, other than holding hands. And it was an organized. So history is always written by those who, the history that we know is written by those who control it. What was happening was a movement that was intellectual, that was philosophical, on the campuses of Berkeley, on the campuses of Michigan. But what we heard about was the guns and that sort of thing. So there was this contrast.
And
what do you want?
And to go back to your question, John, King would, within a year or two of this, be putting down, restiveness within his movement from younger people who are saying, nonviolence is great in theory, but what's it getting us? It's getting us those four, or what's it not protecting us from? It's not protecting us from what happened to the 4 girls in Birmingham. It's not protecting us against what happened to Jimmy Lee Jackson in the Selma area. It's not protecting us from what happened to the voting rights workers in Mississippi. Do you also detect in this a weariness? And I'm thinking, I'm gonna do the music here. I'm thinking about the recurrence near the end of that first section and near the end of it, where they play da 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 dun dun bum bum bum. It just feels like the weight of the world is on them, and it's like, why do we have to keep going through this? You think about that Lamentations that I put up. Like, God, where are you? Why does this keep happening to us? Why do you let this keep going on?
Yeah, with that initial theme, I thought of the biblical quote, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?
Yeah. And Coltrane would have known that well.
Yeah.
He was a religious person.
So, Coltrane came out of the bebop area. And if you ever listen to bebop, the differences in syncopation and tonality and range of notes were extraordinary. And here you have a very simple melody, repetitive, a dirge-like feel.
Yeah, it's a lament.
And it's remarkable given his body of work. Unless you understand Coltrane and bebop, this maybe doesn't have as much impact.
This was not a typical Coltrane piece.
And it stayed in the minor key.
Yeah.
It did not go atonal like Coltrane often does.
Musician?
Well, I was thinking some of the things that he didn't show all his virtuosity with the horn that he often does.
Right.
But it was all the virtuosity of tone and melody. And just great beauty.
That beginning line that it starts with and that it ends with, thanks, Audrey, supposedly, and he never said that this was about the bombing, but it was absolutely about what had been happening in Alabama for years. He never denied that. But that long, arresting beginning line before he breaks into the solo, some people have suggested that he took that from the kind of rhythm of a king sermon or a king's speech, although it's never been clear which one. And the last thing in terms of this, Ben Ratliff, the former Times jazz critic, calls it a striking piece of music. If anyone wants to begin to understand how Coltrane could inspire so much awe so quickly, the reason is probably inside Alabama. The steel-trap knowledge of harmony, the writing, that's all very impressive. But Alabama is also an accurate psychological portrait of a time, a complicated movement that no one else could render so well. Okay, so we're down to 45 seconds. Would anybody venture to take a shot at the extent to which King and Coltrane resembled one another in their response to the bomb? I mean, if you Venn diagrammed it, you'd see lamentation and grief in the intersection zone. But maybe the point that you were raising, Clarence, would be in the different places. King's emphasis is much more on staying with it, staying with reconciliation, staying with the beloved community. Coltrane maybe not so much.
Yeah, I think this is closer to the other side of the movement. Specifically, the powerful one was the Black Panther Party.
What was the what?
Black Panther Party.
Yeah.
Which
I
is
heard more anger in Coltrane, whereas I heard more hope
and forgiveness.
and forgiveness.
Yeah. You know, I mean, we get to Martin Luther King Day every year, and there's a kind of a you know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace. There's a kind of a cheap way to do Martin Luther King Day, and that is, you know, to kind of say, I have a dream, and how wonderful we achieved that dream. I'm not sure that we have. I'm not sure we're gonna anytime soon, but I also think it's important for us to look beyond that one speech, and that's kind of what we're trying to do today. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rich, for this gift. I've personally never seen Martin Luther King and Coltrane put together in a class, so I'm really excited that we did this today. If you didn't sign in, just sign in before you leave so that we have our numbers together. So thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.